My hands were shaking before I even reached my desk. I pulled my sleeve down over the mark on my wrist and prayed no one would notice. The office lights felt too bright that morning, like they were designed to expose every secret I carried. My name is Claire Bennett, and I am the personal secretary to Damon Cross, a man whose name alone made grown executives lower their voices. I had worked for him for 2 years, arriving before sunrise and leaving long after the building emptied. I was good at my job because I was good at disappearing. I answered his calls, arranged his meetings, and made myself as invisible as furniture. Nobody asks questions of the furniture. That morning, I sat down at my desk and opened the calendar for the day. 3 meetings, 1 lunch with an investor from Chicago, and a call scheduled with someone from the shipping division. Ordinary tasks. I liked ordinary tasks. They gave me a place to put my mind so it would not wander to what happened the night before. Ethan had come to my apartment again. He always came when I least expected it, usually after a night of drinking, always with the same excuse. He said he missed me. He said he only wanted to talk. Then his voice would rise, and his hand would rise with it, and I would spend the next morning finding new ways to hide what he left behind. I told myself it would stop. I told myself that every single time, and every single time I was wrong. The elevator doors opened, and I straightened my spine the way I always did when Damon Cross was near. He walked with the kind of certainty that made rooms go quiet. He was tall, dressed in a charcoal suit that looked tailored to punish anyone who dared compare their own appearance to his. His eyes were dark, sharp, and always moving, cataloging everything around him before anyone realized he was paying attention. "Good morning, Miss Bennett," he said, not slowing his pace as he passed my desk. "Good morning, sir," I replied, keeping my eyes on my screen. He paused. I felt it before I saw it, the way the air around my desk seemed to still. I looked up, and his gaze had dropped to my wrist, just for a second, just long enough to notice the edge of a bruise peeking out from beneath my sleeve, before I could tug it back down. "Is everything all right?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was a weight to it that made the question feel larger than small talk. "Yes, sir, I bumped it on a cabinet door," I said quickly, the lie sliding out smooth and practiced. I had used it before. I would use it again. He studied me for a moment longer than necessary. I could not read his expression. It was not concern exactly, not yet, but it was not indifference either. It was something colder and more precise, like he was filing the information away for later use. "Careful with those cabinets," he said finally, and walked into his office without another word. I exhaled slowly once the door closed behind him. My heart was pounding, though I could not explain why. Damon Cross had never shown interest in my personal life before. I was one of hundreds of employees who moved through his building like clockwork, replaceable and forgettable. That was how I liked it. Forgettable people did not get hurt twice. The morning moved forward in its usual rhythm. I fielded calls, rescheduled a meeting that conflicted with another, and printed reports that Damon barely glanced at before signing. Around 11, my phone buzzed with a message from Ethan. "I need to see you tonight. Don't ignore me, Claire." My stomach twisted into a knot. I turned the phone face down on my desk and tried to focus on the spreadsheet in front of me, but the numbers blurred together. I had blocked his number twice, and twice he had found new ways around it. New accounts, new apps, always finding a crack in the wall I tried to build. I had not told anyone about Ethan, not my coworkers, not my family, and certainly not my boss. What would I even say? That the man I once thought I loved had become someone I no longer recognized? That I stayed silent because leaving felt more dangerous than staying? Shame has a way of sealing your mouth shut, even when your body is screaming to speak. At noon, Damon buzzed the intercom on my desk. "Ms. Bennett, come in for a moment." I straightened my blazer and walked into his office, notepad in hand out of habit, though he rarely needed me to write anything down. His office was vast, all glass and dark wood, with a view of the city that made the busy streets below look like toy models. He was standing near the window, his back to me. "You wanted something, sir?" I asked. The Chicago investor moved the lunch to 1:30. "Confirm the reservation," he said without turning around. "Of course," I said, already turning to leave. "Claire." I stopped. He rarely used my first name. It felt strange hearing it in his voice, too personal for the distance we always kept between us. "Yes, sir." He turned to face me now, his expression unreadable. "If something is wrong, you can tell me. I don't tolerate problems festering in my company. Whatever it is, personal or professional, I would rather know." My throat tightened. For a moment I considered telling him everything. The fear, the bruises, the messages I could not escape. But old habits ran deep, and fear had taught me that silence was safer than truth. "Everything is fine, sir. Thank you for asking," I said, forcing a small, convincing smile. He nodded slowly, though I could tell he did not believe me. "All right, that will be all." I left his office feeling like I had narrowly avoided something, though I could not say what. The rest of the day passed in a blur of phone calls and rescheduled meetings. By the time 6 o'clock arrived, the office had mostly emptied, leaving only the hum of computers and the distant sound of a vacuum cleaner somewhere down the hall. I packed my bag slowly, dreading the walk to my car. Ethan's message from earlier sat unanswered in my phone, and I knew ignoring him would only make tonight worse if he decided to show up anyway. I had learned to read his moods through text messages the way sailors read storm clouds, and tonight's message carried the kind of tension that usually meant trouble. As I walked toward the parking garage, my phone buzzed again. "I know you're avoiding me. I'm coming over." My hands trembled as I typed a response, begging him not to come, promising we could talk another day. I hit send and shoved the phone into my bag, quickening my pace toward my car. I did not notice the black sedan parked near the garage entrance, engine idling, windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat inside. I did not think anything of it as I unlocked my car and slid into the driver's seat, my mind consumed with dread over what waited for me at home. What I did not know was that Damon Cross had already seen the message on my phone earlier that day, reflected for half a second on my screen when I set it face down too slowly during our conversation. He had also seen the photograph I kept tucked inside my wallet, the one I never meant for anyone to find, a photograph of Ethan and me from happier days, taken before the mask cracked and the truth beneath it revealed itself. Damon Cross was not a man who ignored details. He built his empire by noticing what others missed, by connecting threads that seemed unrelated until the full picture emerged. A bruise on a wrist, a flinch during a meeting, a name whispered nervously into a phone. These were not random pieces to him. They were the beginning of an investigation he had already set into motion without my knowledge. That night, as I drove home with my knuckles white against the steering wheel, a car I did not recognize followed 2 lengths behind me, keeping a careful, practiced distance. I would not learn until much later that the man behind the wheel worked for Damon, and that my boss had quietly ordered someone to track my movements the moment he noticed the bruise on my wrist that morning. I pulled into my apartment complex and sat in my car for a long moment, staring at the darkened windows of my building, gathering whatever courage I had left before facing another night I could not control. I did not know that somewhere across the city, a man with more power than I understood was already piecing together the truth I had spent months trying to hide, and that my carefully guarded secret was about to unravel in ways I never expected. Inside my apartment, I dropped my bag by the door and stood in the quiet for a moment, listening for any sound that might mean I was not alone. The silence felt heavier than usual, pressing against my chest like a hand I could not push away. I checked the lock twice, then a third time, before finally allowing myself to breathe. I made a cup of tea I did not drink, and sat on the edge of my couch, staring at my phone as though it might explode if I touched it. Ethan had not messaged again since the last one, and somehow that silence frightened me more than his words ever did. Silence from him usually meant he was already on his way. My mind drifted back to the early days, when things between us had felt warm and uncomplicated. He used to bring me coffee before work, remembered small details about my life that made me feel seen. I used to think I had found something rare. It was strange how easily warmth could curdle into something unrecognizable, how slowly the change crept in, until one day, I looked around and realized I was afraid of the person I once trusted most. A knock came at exactly 9, 3 sharp raps that I recognized immediately. My stomach dropped. I did not move from the couch at first, hoping that if I stayed still enough, he might believe I was not home. But another knock followed, harder this time, and I knew ignoring him would only make things worse. I opened the door a few inches, keeping the chain latched. Ethan stood in the hallway, his jacket rumpled, his eyes carrying that familiar glassy edge that told me he had been drinking again. "Why didn't you answer me?" he said, his voice low, but sharp enough to make me flinch. "I was busy, Ethan." "It's late," I said, trying to keep my tone even, trying not to give him any reason to escalate. "Busy doing what? Who were you with?" His words came faster now, stacking on top of each other, the way they always did before things turned. "I was alone." "I'm always alone," I said quietly, and for a moment, I thought the honesty in my voice might reach him, might remind him of the person he used to be before all of this started. Instead, his jaw tightened, and he pressed his palm against the door, testing the chain lock. "Let me in. We need to talk about this like adults." "I don't think tonight is a good night," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair, and for a moment, I thought he might actually leave. Then his eyes locked onto mine again, colder now, more deliberate. "You can't keep doing this, Claire. You can't keep shutting me out like I don't matter. I need space, Ethan. That's all I'm asking for." "Space," he repeated, the word twisting bitterly on his tongue. "You didn't need space 6 months ago." I did not answer. There was nothing I could say that would make sense to him in that moment, not when the version of him standing in my hallway was not someone reason could reach. He stared at me for a long, tense moment, then finally stepped back, shaking his head as though I had wasted his time. "This isn't over," he muttered, before turning and walking down the hallway, his footsteps heavy against the floor. I closed the door and slid down against it, until I was sitting on the floor, my knees pulled to my chest, listening to the sound of his footsteps fade into silence. I stayed there for a long time before finally finding the strength to stand and check the lock one more time. I did not sleep much that night. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation, wondering how many more nights would look exactly like this one, before something finally broke, one way or another. I thought about calling someone, a friend, a family member, even the police, but every time I reached for my phone, the same old fear stopped me. What if they did not believe me? What if speaking the truth out loud made it more real than I could handle? By the time my alarm rang the next morning, exhaustion sat heavy behind my eyes. I dressed carefully, choosing a blouse with sleeves long enough to cover the fresh mark Ethan had left on my forearm when he grabbed me on his way out, a small, careless motion that he probably did not even remember making. I applied concealer with practiced precision, blending it until my skin looked untouched, until the mirror reflected back the same composed woman who walked into the office every single day. I drove to work replaying the previous night in my mind, wondering if Damon had truly noticed the bruise the day before, or if I had imagined the weight in his gaze. Executives like him did not concern themselves with the personal lives of their secretaries. I told myself that repeatedly during the drive, trying to convince the anxious part of my mind that I was overthinking things, that I was still safe in my careful invisibility. I did not know, as I pulled into the parking garage that morning, that the black sedan from the night before was already parked 2 rows from my usual spot, and that the man inside had spent the previous evening documenting everything he witnessed outside my apartment building. I did not know that a folder was already being prepared on Damon Cross's desk, filled with details about a man named Ethan Walsh, his address, his employment history, and a pattern of behavior that painted a picture far darker than the version of him I had once fallen for. I stepped out of my car, pulled my coat tighter around myself, and walked toward the building entrance, unaware that everything was about to change. The intercom on my desk buzzed at exactly 10 in the morning, and Damon's voice came through, flat and controlled. "Ms. Bennett, come in." I gathered my notepad out of habit and walked into his office, expecting another request about schedules or documents. Instead, I found him standing behind his desk, a manila folder resting closed in front of him, his expression unusually still. "Close the door," he said. My pulse quickened as I did what he asked. Something about the tone of his voice told me this was not going to be an ordinary conversation. "Sit down, Claire." I sat, my hands folding neatly in my lap the way they always did when I felt uncertain. He studied me for a long moment, before sliding the folder across the desk toward me. "Open it," he said. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the cover. Inside were photographs, printed clearly and cleanly, of Ethan standing outside my apartment building the night before. There were timestamps in the corner of each image, along with notes detailing the exact minutes he arrived and left. Beneath the photographs sat a typed report containing his full name, his employment history, his address, and a list of prior incidents that made my stomach turn cold. "What is this?" I whispered, though I already understood exactly what I was looking at. "That is the man who has been hurting you," Damon said, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge sharp enough to cut glass. "His name is Ethan Walsh. He works at a logistics company 3 blocks from here. He has 2 prior complaints filed against him for harassment, both dropped before they reached a courtroom. He was outside your building last night for 40 minutes. I stared at the photographs, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. "You had someone follow me?" "I had someone protect you," Damon corrected, his tone even, though something dangerous simmered beneath the calm surface of his words. "The moment I noticed the bruise on your wrist yesterday morning, I made a call. I do not tolerate ignorance in my own company, Claire, and I certainly do not tolerate it towards someone who has worked loyally for me for 2 years. Anger rose in my chest, hot and sudden, cutting through the fear that usually silenced me. "You had no right. This is my life, my business. You don't get to dig into it just because you noticed a bruise." "I disagree," he said simply. "When something threatens the well-being of someone under my roof, it becomes my business, whether you invite me into it or not." "That's not how this works," I said, my voice rising despite myself. "You can't just decide to control every part of someone's life because you have the power to do it." Something flickered across his face then, a shadow of an emotion I could not quite name. He walked around the desk slowly and leaned against its edge, closer to me now, though still maintaining a careful, deliberate distance. "You are right," he said, surprising me. "I overstepped. I understand that, but I will not apologize for gathering information that keeps you safe. I have seen what men like him become when left unchecked, and I refuse to watch it happen to someone in my own building without doing something about it." I looked down at the photographs again, my anger tangled painfully with something else, something that felt dangerously close to relief. For months I had carried this secret alone, convinced that no one would notice, that no one would care enough to look closely. Yet here was proof that someone had noticed, had cared enough to act, even if his methods felt invasive and unwelcome. "How long have you known?" I asked quietly. "I suspected something the first time you flinched when I raised my voice during a meeting. Months ago," he admitted. "I told myself it was not my place to ask. Yesterday, when I saw the bruise, I decided I was done assuming it was not my place." Tears burned behind my eyes, though I refused to let them fall in front of him. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't ask for anyone to fix my problems." "I am not trying to fix anything," Damon said, his voice softening slightly, though the intensity in his eyes remained unchanged. "I am trying to make sure you are not facing this alone anymore, whether you asked for that or not." Silence stretched between us, heavy and uncertain. I closed the folder slowly, my hands still trembling, though whether from anger or something closer to gratitude, I could not say. "What happens now?" I asked finally. "That depends on what you want," he said. "I can make sure he never comes near you again. I have resources most people do not have access to, and I am willing to use them. But I will not act without your permission. This is your life, as you said. I only wanted you to know that you are not invisible here, no matter how hard you try to convince yourself otherwise." The words struck something deep inside me, a place I had kept guarded for so long that I had almost forgotten it existed. Invisible. That was exactly what I had tried to become, both at work and in my relationship, believing that if I made myself small enough, quiet enough, the danger around me might simply pass me by. "I need time to think," I said finally, gathering the folder and holding it against my chest like a shield. "Take whatever time you need," Damon said, stepping back to give me space. "But know that the offer does not expire, Claire. Whatever you decide, I am not going to pretend I did not see what I saw." I left his office in a daze, walking back to my desk on legs that felt unsteady beneath me. I sat down slowly, staring at the folder in my hands, unable to focus on the work waiting on my screen. For the first time in months, someone had looked past the careful mask I wore every day and had seen the truth underneath it, not with pity, but with something closer to quiet, unshakable resolve. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I answered calls mechanically, rescheduled meetings without truly registering the details, and avoided eye contact whenever Damon passed my desk. I could feel his gaze occasionally, brief and searching, though he never said another word about the folder or its contents. That evening, as I packed my things to leave, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I know you talked to him. Big mistake, Claire." My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, reading the words again and again, trying to understand how Ethan could possibly know about the conversation that had happened behind closed doors just hours earlier. Fear coiled tightly in my chest as I gathered my things quickly, my hands shaking as I fumbled with my bag. I walked toward the parking garage faster than usual, glancing over my shoulder more than once, though the hallway behind me remained empty. When I reached my car, I noticed a small folded note tucked beneath my windshield wiper. My stomach dropped as I pulled it free and unfolded it with trembling fingers. "You think a rich boss can protect you? I know where you live. I know where you work. This isn't finished." I stood frozen in the parking garage, the note shaking in my grip, my mind racing through every possible way Ethan could have learned about my conversation with Damon. Had he been watching the building? Had someone told him? The uncertainty terrified me almost as much as the words themselves. I dialed Damon's number before I could talk myself out of it, my fingers trembling as I pressed the phone to my ear. He answered on the second ring. "Claire," he said, his voice immediately alert, as though he sensed the panic in my silence before I spoke a single word. "He knows," I said, my voice breaking. "He left a note on my car. He said this isn't finished." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and when Damon spoke again, his voice had shifted into something colder, more precise, the same tone he used when handling matters that required absolute control. "Stay where you are. Lock your doors. I am sending someone to you right now, and I will meet you there myself." "Damon, I don't know if—" "Claire," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "You called me for a reason. Let me help you, please." I stood in the empty parking garage, the note still trembling in my hand, torn between old habits of silence and a new, unfamiliar instinct that told me it might finally be safe to ask for help. For the first time in longer than I could remember, I chose to trust that instinct. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll wait." The line went quiet, but I could hear the distant sound of a car door closing on his end, followed by the low hum of an engine starting. Whatever Damon Cross was about to do, I understood in that moment that my carefully guarded secret had officially become something neither of us could ignore any longer. I locked myself inside my car, my eyes scanning the parking garage through the rearview mirror, every shadow suddenly suspicious, every distant footstep amplified in my ears. Minutes passed like hours. I kept the note clutched in my lap, staring at the harsh, jagged handwriting, trying to convince myself that Ethan was simply trying to frighten me, that he would not actually follow through on whatever threat lingered behind those words. A dark car pulled into the garage first, moving with a controlled, deliberate speed that told me whoever drove it was not a stranger to tense situations. A man stepped out, broad-shouldered, wearing a plain black jacket, his eyes sweeping the garage methodically before he approached my car and knocked gently on the window. "Miss Bennett," he said, his voice calm and professional. "Mr. Cross sent me. I'm going to stay with you until he arrives." I rolled the window down a few inches, still cautious despite the reassurance in his tone. "How do I know you're really from him?" The man nodded, as though he expected the question, and held up his phone, showing a message thread with Damon's name at the top, along with a photo of me that must have been taken from the security footage near my desk. It should have unsettled me further, the idea that Damon had access to images of me without my knowledge, but in that moment, surrounded by fear, it felt strangely like proof that I was not imagining the protection being offered. "Okay," I said quietly, unlocking the door enough for him to stand guard beside my car without fully opening it. He positioned himself a respectful distance away, scanning the garage entrance with practiced patience. 10 minutes later, another car arrived, sleek and dark, moving with the same unhurried authority I recognized from Damon himself. He stepped out before the car had fully stopped, his coat unbuttoned, his expression sharper than I had ever seen it in the office. He walked straight to my window, and for the first time since I had known him, I saw something in his eyes that looked almost like worry. "Show me the note," he said. I handed it to him through the small gap in the window, watching his jaw tighten as he read the words. He folded it carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket, his movements precise, controlled, as though he were already 3 steps ahead in a plan I could not yet see. "Has he contacted you since this arrived?" he asked. "No, just this and the message before it." "Good," he said, though the word carried no comfort, only calculation. "You are not going home tonight. I have a property that is secure, staffed, and completely private. You will stay there until we understand exactly what he intends to do." Panic fluttered in my chest at the thought of leaving my apartment, my routine, the small, fragile normalcy I had clung to for so long. "Damon, I can't just disappear. I have work tomorrow. You have a man leaving threatening notes on your car in a parking garage," he interrupted, his voice firm but not unkind. "Your safety comes before your schedule, Claire. I will handle work. I will handle everything else. Tonight, I only need you to trust me." I looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of manipulation, any hidden motive beneath the concern. I found none, only the same unshakable resolve I had seen earlier that day in his office, the look of a man who had already decided how this would end, and was simply waiting for me to catch up. "Okay," I said finally, the word feeling heavier than it should have. "I'll come with you." He nodded once, then turned to the man standing guard beside my car. "Follow us. I want eyes on her building tonight, in case he shows up looking for her." The man nodded and moved toward his own vehicle, without hesitation, the kind of quiet obedience that told me exactly how seriously people in Damon's world took his instructions. I stepped out of my car slowly, my legs still unsteady, and followed Damon toward his waiting vehicle, the note from Ethan still tucked inside his coat pocket like evidence in a case that had only just begun. As we pulled out of the garage, the city lights blurred past the window, and I allowed myself, for the first time in longer than I could remember, to stop bracing for the next blow. Whatever waited for me at the end of this drive, I understood that the quiet, invisible life I had built to protect myself was over, replaced now by something far more uncertain and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined possible. The property Damon brought me to sat behind a tall iron gate, hidden from the main road by a line of dense trees that swayed gently in the night wind. The house itself looked less like a home and more like a fortress dressed in elegant stone, with warm light glowing behind curtained windows, and 2 men stationed near the entrance who nodded silently as we passed. Inside, the space was quiet, tasteful, and unmistakably guarded. A woman I did not recognize greeted us in the foyer, introducing herself simply as Marta, offering to show me to a room upstairs. I glanced at Damon, uncertain, and he gave a small nod, as though granting permission for me to follow her without needing to ask. "You'll be safe here," he said. "I have matters to attend to tonight, but I will not be far." I wanted to ask what matters meant, exactly, but exhaustion and fear had drained whatever courage I had left. I followed Marta up a wide staircase to a room that felt more like a hotel suite than a bedroom. Soft lighting, a made bed, a small stack of folded clothes waiting on the dresser, as though someone had anticipated I would arrive with nothing but the clothes on my back. I sat on the edge of the bed once I was alone, staring at my trembling hands, replaying the events of the last few hours over and over. Yesterday, I had been an invisible secretary hiding bruises beneath long sleeves. Tonight, I was hiding inside a stranger's fortress, protected by men with guarded expressions and quiet authority, because the boss I barely knew had decided my safety mattered more than my privacy. I did not sleep well. Every creak of the house, every distant voice from downstairs, sent my heart racing, though nothing threatening ever came. By the time morning light filtered through the curtains, I had convinced myself that the previous night had been some strange, exhausted dream, until I looked down and saw the note still folded inside my coat pocket, proof that everything had been painfully real. Marta knocked softly around 8, informing me that breakfast waited downstairs and that Damon wished to speak with me once I was ready. I dressed quickly in the clothes left for me, simple, comfortable, clearly chosen, with practical thought rather than luxury, and made my way down the staircase. Damon sat at a long table near a window overlooking a quiet garden, a cup of coffee in front of him, a laptop open beside it. He looked up when I entered, his expression unreadable but attentive. "Sit," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "Eat something. You look like you didn't sleep." "I didn't," I admitted, sliding into the seat, though the smell of fresh coffee did coax my stomach into something resembling hunger. He closed the laptop and studied me for a long moment before speaking again. "I had my people watch your apartment overnight. Ethan Walsh did not return, but he made 3 attempts to call your phone, all after midnight." My stomach twisted. "He called 3 times and I didn't even hear it?" "Your phone was with the driver who followed us last night, per my instructions," Damon said. "I did not want anything alerting him to your exact location before we understood what he intended to do." Part of me bristled at the idea that decisions about my own phone had been made without my knowledge, yet a larger, more exhausted part of me felt an unfamiliar wave of relief at not having to face those calls alone in the dark. "What happens now?" I asked, echoing the same question I had asked in his office the day before. "Now we make sure he understands the consequences of continuing this behavior," Damon said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable edge of finality. "What does that mean exactly?" I asked carefully. "Damon, I don't want anyone getting hurt because of me. I've seen what fear does to people. I don't want to become the reason someone else gets hurt." Something in his expression softened slightly, though the resolve behind his eyes remained unchanged. "No one is going to get physically hurt, Claire, at least not by my hand or my instruction. I deal in leverage, not violence, when leverage accomplishes the same result more efficiently. Ethan Walsh has debts. He has a fragile professional reputation. He has secrets of his own that, if exposed, would cost him everything he still believes he controls. You're going to blackmail him?" "I am going to make it clear that continuing to pursue you will cost him more than he is willing to pay," Damon said simply. "Men like him rely on the assumption that no one is paying attention, that the people they hurt have no one powerful enough to stand between them and their next target. I intend to prove that assumption wrong." I sat quietly for a moment, absorbing the weight of his words, torn between discomfort at the ruthless efficiency of his plan and a deep, aching gratitude that someone finally stood ready to fight a battle I had spent months fighting alone. "Why are you doing this?" I asked finally, the question slipping out before I could stop it. "You barely know me outside of scheduling your meetings and answering your calls." Damon was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting toward the window, toward the quiet garden beyond it. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, something raw beneath the usual controlled surface. "Years ago, someone close to me went through something similar," he said slowly. "I did not notice the signs in time. I told myself it was not my place to interfere, that she would come to me if she needed help. By the time I understood how wrong I was, it was too late to fix what had already happened." The words hung heavy in the room, and I understood, without him needing to explain further, that whatever loss he carried had shaped the man sitting across from me, a man who now refused to look away when he recognized the same warning signs in someone else. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I am not telling you this for sympathy," he said, straightening slightly, the vulnerability retreating back beneath his usual composed exterior. "I am telling you, so you understand why I will not stand by quietly this time. Whatever discomfort my involvement causes you, I would rather face your anger than face the alternative." I nodded slowly, something shifting inside my chest, a small crack forming in the wall I had built around myself, the wall that had convinced me for months that I deserved to face this alone, that asking for help made me weak rather than human. "What do you need from me?" I asked. "Just your permission to proceed, and your promise to stay here until this is resolved," Damon said. "I will handle the rest." I looked down at my hands, still resting on the table, no longer trembling the way they had the night before. "Okay," I said. "Do what you need to do." He nodded once, satisfaction flickering briefly across his expression, before he opened his laptop again, already moving into the next phase of whatever plan had formed in his mind overnight. The following hours passed in a strange, suspended calm. I wandered through the quiet house, exploring rooms I was permitted to enter, watching from a window as men moved purposefully across the property, speaking in low voices into phones, arriving and departing on tasks I was not privy to understand. Marta kept me company for a while, offering small kindnesses, tea, a book from the library downstairs, gentle reassurances that everything would be handled properly. Around noon, Damon reappeared, his expression carrying the same controlled intensity from that morning, though something had shifted, a slight easing in the tension around his shoulders. "It's done," he said simply, finding me in the library where I sat with a book I had not truly been reading. "Ethan Walsh has been informed, in no uncertain terms, that his behavior ends today." "How did he react?" I asked, setting the book aside. "Poorly at first," Damon admitted. "Men like him rarely respond well to losing control. But once he understood the full extent of what continuing would cost him, professionally, financially, and otherwise, his tone changed considerably." "Do you believe him?" I asked. "That he'll actually stop?" Damon considered the question carefully before answering. "I believe fear is a powerful motivator, and right now, he fears the consequences more than he desires whatever twisted satisfaction he found in pursuing you. Whether that fear holds long-term remains to be seen, which is why I intend to keep monitoring the situation closely." I exhaled slowly, a strange mixture of relief and lingering unease settling over me. "Thank you," I said quietly. "I know this isn't something you had to do." "No," he agreed. "But it was something I chose to do, and that distinction matters more to me than you might realize." We sat together in comfortable silence for a while after that, the tension of the past 2 days slowly beginning to loosen its grip on my chest. For the first time since Ethan had first raised his voice against me, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I did not have to hide, where the mask I wore every day might finally be unnecessary. My phone, returned to me after Damon's driver confirmed there were no further threats waiting in it, buzzed once around 6 in the evening. My chest tightened instinctively, old fear rising fast, but when I looked at the screen, the message was not from Ethan at all. It was from my closest coworker, Grace, a woman I had shared quiet lunches with for the past year, without ever telling her the truth of what waited for me at home each night. "Are you okay? You weren't at your desk today, and Mr. Cross's office said you were out on personal matters. Call me if you need anything." I stared at the message for a long moment, guilt pressing against my ribs. Grace had asked me more than once over the past several months if everything was all right, and every time I had brushed her concern aside with practiced ease, the same way I brushed aside everyone who came close enough to notice the cracks beneath my composed surface. I typed a short reply, careful and vague, promising I was fine and would explain when I returned to the office. It felt strange, writing those words while sitting inside a stranger's fortified home, protected by men I did not fully understand, guided by a boss who had somehow become the only person willing to stand between me and the danger I had hidden for so long. Damon found me a short while later, still staring at my phone, and must have noticed the troubled expression on my face because he paused in the doorway rather than continuing past. "Everything all right?" he asked. "A coworker noticed I was gone," I said. "I've spent so long convincing everyone around me that nothing was wrong. I don't even know how I'll explain any of this once I go back." Damon stepped further into the room, leaning against the doorframe, his expression thoughtful. "You don't owe anyone an explanation you're not ready to give, Claire. Not your coworkers, not me, not anyone. Whatever you choose to share, and whenever you choose to share it, that decision belongs entirely to you." "It's strange," I admitted. "For so long I thought staying quiet made me strong, like if I could just endure it silently, that meant I was handling it. But sitting here now, I don't feel weak for finally speaking up. I feel like I can breathe again." Something shifted in Damon's expression then, subtle but unmistakable, a kind of quiet respect that reached his eyes in a way I had not seen from him before. "Silence isn't strength," he said. It's survival. There's a difference. What you're doing now, choosing to let someone help you, that takes far more courage than staying silent ever did. His words settled over me like a warmth I had not expected, chasing away some of the guilt that had been building since Grace's message arrived. I set my phone aside, no longer feeling the need to immediately respond to every question waiting on the other end of it. "Can I ask you something?" I said. "Of course." "The person you mentioned earlier, the one this reminded you of, was she someone in your family?" His jaw tightened briefly, and for a moment, I regretted asking, worried I had pushed too far into territory he preferred to keep locked away. But after a long pause, he answered anyway, his voice quieter than I had heard it before. "My younger sister," he said. "She hid it from all of us for almost 2 years. By the time we found out, she had already convinced herself that leaving was more dangerous than staying. I spent months afterward trying to help her rebuild what was taken from her, and I promised myself I would never again wait until it was too late to act, if I ever recognized those same signs in someone else." "Is she all right now?" I asked gently. "She's safe," Damon said. "It took time, more time than either of us expected, but she found her way back to herself eventually. It's part of why I understand how fragile that process can be, and why I refuse to treat it carelessly." I nodded slowly, understanding settling over me with a clarity I had not expected. This was not simply a powerful man exercising control out of habit or obligation. This was someone carrying his own quiet grief, transforming it into fierce, deliberate protection for someone he barely knew, because he refused to repeat the same mistake twice. "Thank you for telling me that," I said softly. "Thank you for trusting me enough to ask," he replied. Later that evening, as the sun began to set over the quiet garden outside, Damon found me sitting on the back terrace, a blanket wrapped around my shoulders against the cooling air. He joined me without a word, settling into the chair beside mine, watching the colors shift across the sky in comfortable, unhurried silence. "You don't have to stay here indefinitely," he said eventually. "But I would feel better if you remained, at least until we're certain he understands the boundaries clearly." "I think I'd like that," I admitted, surprising myself with how easily the words came. "I haven't felt this safe in longer than I can remember." Damon glanced at me then, something unreadable flickering behind his dark eyes, something that felt less like the calculated control I had grown used to seeing, and more like quiet, careful warmth. "Good," he said simply. That was the goal. We sat together as the last light faded from the sky, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I did not feel the need to check the locks twice, to flinch at unexpected sounds, to hide behind sleeves and careful lies. Whatever came next, I understood that the invisible life I had built to survive was finally beginning to change into something entirely different, something I had almost forgotten was possible. I returned to the office 5 days later, my absence explained through a short, official note about personal matters that Damon's assistant had circulated to close the subject before anyone could ask too many questions. Grace met me at my desk within minutes, her eyes searching mine with the kind of quiet worry that told me she suspected there was more to the story than anyone had shared. "You look different," she said carefully, sliding into the chair beside my desk during a lull between calls. "Lighter, somehow. Are you going to tell me what happened?" I hesitated, old instincts urging me to deflect the question the way I always had, but something inside me had shifted over the past several days, a small but persistent voice reminding me that silence had never actually protected me, only delayed the moment when the truth demanded to be heard. "I will," I said, "just not today. It's a long story." Grace nodded, accepting the boundary without pushing further, though the warmth in her expression told me she would be there whenever I was ready to share more. It was a small moment, quiet and unremarkable to anyone watching, but it felt like the first crack of sunlight breaking through a door I had kept locked for far too long. The office rhythm slowly returned to something resembling normal, though I noticed subtle changes almost immediately. Damon began including me in meetings I would never have attended before, brief but deliberate gestures that placed me closer to decisions typically reserved for senior staff. At first, I assumed it was simply a byproduct of everything that had happened between us, a temporary adjustment born from circumstance rather than genuine trust. But as the days passed, the pattern continued. He asked my opinion during strategy discussions, listened carefully when I offered input, and began treating me less like an assistant whose role was to disappear quietly into the background, and more like someone whose perspective genuinely mattered to him. Rumors began circulating through the office almost immediately. I overheard whispered conversations near the break room, speculation about why the notoriously private Damon Cross had suddenly taken such visible interest in his secretary. Some assumed favoritism, others assumed something more personal. I ignored most of it, though the attention made me increasingly self-conscious, uncertain how to navigate a version of my professional life that no longer allowed me to remain comfortably invisible. One morning, a senior manager named Oliver stopped by my desk, under the pretense of discussing a budget report, though his questions quickly drifted toward Damon's sudden change in behavior. "He's never let anyone sit in on strategy meetings who wasn't already department head," Oliver said, his tone carrying more curiosity than accusation. "People are talking, Claire. I just thought you should know." "Let them talk," I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. A few weeks earlier, the mere suggestion of being the subject of office gossip would have sent me retreating further into silence, desperate to smooth over any attention drawn toward myself. Now, the words settled easily, almost naturally, a quiet reminder of how much had shifted beneath the surface of my daily life. Oliver studied me for a moment, clearly expecting a more defensive reaction, before shrugging and returning to his own office, apparently satisfied that whatever mystery surrounded the situation was not his concern to solve. I sat back in my chair afterward, oddly proud of myself for not shrinking beneath the weight of speculation the way I once would have. That evening, I mentioned the exchange to Damon as we walked together toward the parking garage, the city lights beginning to flicker on above us in the gathering dusk. "People are noticing," I said. "The meetings, the walks to my car. I don't think we've been particularly subtle." "Does that bother you?" he asked, glancing sideways at me, his expression carefully neutral, though I had learned by then to recognize the subtle tension in his jaw whenever a question mattered more to him than he wanted to admit. "Strangely, no," I admitted. "I spent so long trying to disappear that I think part of me expected being seen to feel unbearable. It doesn't. It feels like relief." A small, rare smile touched the corner of his mouth, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, though I caught it before it vanished entirely. "Good," he said simply. "I never wanted you disappearing in the first place, Claire. I only respected that it was your choice to make, until it stopped being safe for you to keep making it alone." A few days later, I finally told Grace everything, sitting across from her at a small cafe, 2 blocks from the office during our lunch hour. I explained Ethan, the months of hiding, the folder on Damon's desk, the note on my windshield, the quiet fortress, where I had spent 5 days learning what safety actually felt like. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression shifting from shock to anger, to something gentler as the story unfolded. "I wish you had told me sooner," she said finally, reaching across the table to squeeze my hand. "You didn't have to carry that alone, Claire." "I know that now," I said. "I think some part of me always knew it, but knowing something and believing you deserve it are very different things." "And Mr. Cross?" Grace asked, a knowing look creeping into her expression. "What exactly is going on there?" I laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar and warm in my own ears. "I honestly don't know yet, but it doesn't feel like anything I've experienced before. It feels careful, patient, like nothing is being demanded of me." "That's not nothing," Grace said gently. "That's actually everything, Claire." Her words stayed with me for the rest of the day, settling into the quiet spaces of my mind as I returned to my desk and resumed the familiar rhythm of calls and schedules. I found myself watching Damon differently that afternoon, noticing the careful way he treated everyone around him, not just me, the quiet respect he extended even to the newest hires, the patience he showed junior staff who stumbled through their first presentations. It was not performance. It was simply who he was, beneath the cold reputation that preceded him through every boardroom in the city. One afternoon, nearly 2 weeks after everything had happened, Damon called me into his office at the end of the day, long after most of the staff had already left for the evening. He gestured for me to sit, though his posture carried a tension I had not seen from him since the initial days of the crisis. "I need to ask you something," he said, and I need you to answer honestly." "Okay," I said carefully, bracing myself for whatever came next. "Are you comfortable with how things have changed between us professionally? I am aware that my involvement in your personal situation may have blurred boundaries that should have remained clearer. If my behavior has made your position here uncomfortable in any way, I need to know." The question surprised me, both in its directness and in the vulnerability beneath it. This was not the same controlled, untouchable executive I had worked for during my first 2 years at the company. This was someone genuinely concerned about the impact of his actions, someone willing to examine his own behavior rather than assume his intentions excused any discomfort they might have caused. "Honestly," I said slowly, choosing my words with care, "I don't know exactly what to call what's happening between us. But uncomfortable isn't the right word for it. If anything, I feel more like myself here than I have in longer than I can remember." Something shifted in his expression, relief mixed with something else, something warmer and more complicated than simple professional concern. "I have spent the last 2 weeks trying to convince myself that my actions were purely about ensuring your safety," he said. "But I think we would both be lying if we pretended that explanation still fully applies." My heart quickened at the admission, uncertain how to respond to the shift in the conversation, the way the air between us seemed to thicken with something neither of us had directly acknowledged until that moment. "What are you saying?" I asked quietly. "I am saying that somewhere between the folder on my desk and the conversation on my terrace, my concern for your safety became something more personal than I intended it to become," he said, his voice steady despite the weight of the confession. "I am not asking anything of you, Claire. I only wanted to be honest, given everything you've already been through." I sat quietly for a long moment, processing the enormity of what he had just admitted, torn between the fear that had governed my choices for so long and the unfamiliar warmth blooming steadily in my chest, despite every instinct telling me to remain cautious. "I don't know how to trust something like this," I admitted finally. "Not after everything with Ethan. I don't know how to separate genuine care from something that might eventually turn into control." "That's fair," Damon said, nodding slowly, no trace of offense in his expression. "I would never ask you to trust blindly, especially not after what you survived. Take whatever time you need. I am not going anywhere, and I have no intention of pressuring you into anything you are not ready for." The sincerity in his voice settled something anxious inside me, a recognition that whatever this was becoming between us, it did not carry the same suffocating urgency that had defined my relationship with Ethan. There was patience here, respect, an acknowledgement of boundaries, rather than a demand that they be erased entirely. "Thank you," I said quietly, "for saying that instead of pushing." "You deserve patience," he said simply. "After everything, you deserve nothing less." I left his office that evening with my thoughts tangled in ways I had not expected, with careful walls I had built around myself trembling slightly under the weight of possibility. For months, I had convinced myself that safety meant invisibility, that protecting myself required shrinking into a version of myself small enough to avoid notice entirely. Yet here was a man who had noticed everything, who had chosen to act rather than look away, and who now offered patience rather than pressure in the uncertain space that followed. Over the following days, our dynamic continued to shift subtly, small moments accumulating into something neither of us named directly, but both seemed to recognize. He began waiting occasionally to walk me to my car after long evenings at the office, not out of obligation, but out of quiet, consistent care. I found myself looking forward to those short walks, the easy conversation that filled the silence, the unfamiliar comfort of feeling genuinely safe beside another person. Then, nearly 3 weeks after the folder first appeared on his desk, Grace approached me during a quiet afternoon, her expression serious, in a way that immediately caught my attention. "I heard something today," she said carefully, glancing around to ensure no one else was listening, "about Ethan. Someone mentioned his name near the elevator, something about him showing up outside the building." My stomach dropped instantly, old fear rushing back with a speed that startled me, undoing weeks of carefully rebuilt calm in a matter of seconds. "Are you sure?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. "I'm not certain," Grace admitted, "but I thought you should know, just in case." I thanked her quietly, my mind already racing toward Damon's office, uncertain whether the fragile peace I had begun to build was about to shatter entirely, or whether this was simply the final test before it could truly hold. I found Damon in his office within minutes, my heart pounding as I relayed exactly what Grace had told me. His expression darkened, though his voice remained carefully controlled, the same calm precision he wielded like a weapon whenever a situation demanded absolute focus. "Where was he seen?" he asked immediately. "Near the main entrance, according to what Grace heard. I don't know how reliable the information is." Damon was already reaching for his phone, dialing a number I did not recognize, his voice low and clipped as he issued instructions to whoever answered on the other end. I stood frozen near his desk, old fear tightening its grip around my chest, despite the weeks of progress I had made toward feeling safe again. "My men are checking the building perimeter now," he said, setting the phone down. "If he is here, we will know within minutes." "I thought this was over," I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. "You said he understood the consequences." "He did," Damon said firmly, "which is exactly why, if he has returned despite that understanding, we need to treat this with more seriousness than before, not less." The next several minutes stretched unbearably long as we waited for confirmation. I paced near the window, watching the street below, half expecting to see Ethan's familiar figure among the pedestrians moving along the sidewalk. Damon remained remarkably still, though I noticed the tension coiled tightly in his shoulders, the careful way his eyes tracked every movement outside the glass. His phone rang, and he answered immediately, listening intently before speaking again. "Confirmed," he said, ending the call and turning to face me fully. He was outside the main entrance for roughly 10 minutes before leaving. My men followed him to a bar 3 blocks from here. He's still there now. "What do we do?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected. "We finish this properly this time," Damon said. "No warnings, no leverage negotiations. I want him to understand, in no uncertain terms, exactly what will happen if he ever comes near you again." Something inside me shifted then, a resolve solidifying that had been building steadily over the past several weeks. "I want to be there," I said. Damon's eyes narrowed slightly, concern flickering across his expression. "Claire, that isn't necessary. I can handle this without putting you anywhere near him again." "I know you can," I said, "but I've spent months letting him control my choices through fear. I don't want this ending with someone else fighting my battle while I hide somewhere safe. I need to face him myself, with you beside me instead of me. Instead of me." He studied me for a long moment, weighing my request against his own instinct to shield me from further confrontation. Finally, he nodded slowly. "All right. But you stay close to me the entire time, no exceptions." Before we left the office, Damon paused near the door, turning back to look at me one final time. "Once we walk into that room, there is no undoing what happens next. If any part of you wants to step back and let me handle this without you present, now is the moment to say so. I will not think less of you either way." I considered his words carefully, feeling the familiar pull of old fear urging me toward the safer, quieter path, the one where someone else fought my battles, while I waited somewhere protected and unseen. But beneath that fear sat something newer, sturdier, a version of myself that had spent the past several weeks learning what it meant to stand in the light instead of shrinking from it. "I'm sure," I said, "I need him to hear this from me, not just from you." Damon studied my face for a long moment, something like pride flickering behind his careful expression, before he nodded once and opened the door, guiding me toward the car waiting outside. The drive across the city passed mostly in silence, though his hand found mine partway through the journey, steady and warm, a quiet reminder that I would not be facing this moment alone. We arrived at the bar within the hour, Damon's driver parking discreetly across the street, while 2 of his men entered ahead of us, positioning themselves near the exits without drawing unnecessary attention. Damon walked beside me toward the entrance, his hand resting lightly against my lower back, not possessive, but steady, a quiet reassurance that I was not walking into this alone. Ethan sat at the far end of the bar, a half-empty glass in front of him, his shoulders hunched in the familiar posture I recognized from countless nights spent bracing for his unpredictable moods. He looked up as we approached, his expression shifting rapidly from confusion to something colder, more defensive. "Claire," he said, his voice carrying a forced casualness that did not mask the tension underneath. "And the boss. Should have known you'd bring backup." "You were told to stay away from her," Damon said, his voice low and controlled, carrying the same dangerous calm I had witnessed in his office weeks earlier. "I just wanted to see her," Ethan said, standing slowly, swaying slightly from whatever he had already consumed. "Is that a crime now? Caring about someone?" "What you call caring, I call something else entirely," I said, surprising myself with the steadiness in my voice. Every instinct urged me to shrink back, to soften my words, to avoid provoking the anger simmering just beneath his controlled surface. Instead, I stood my ground, Damon a solid, unwavering presence beside me. Ethan's eyes flicked toward me, something desperate and unstable flashing behind them. "You think you can just replace me? With him? You have no idea who he really is, Claire. What kind of man you've actually attached yourself to." "I know exactly who he is," I said. "He's someone who noticed when I was hurting, and chose to act instead of looking away. That's more than I can say for you." Something in Ethan's expression cracked then, the mask of forced calm shattering into raw, unstable anger. He took a step forward, and immediately Damon shifted his position, placing himself slightly between us, though his eyes never left Ethan's face. "I would think very carefully about your next move," Damon said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that made even the bartender nearby pause and glance toward our small, tense gathering. Ethan's jaw clenched, his hands curling into fists at his sides, though something in Damon's unwavering stillness seemed to give him pause. The two men Damon had brought inside moved closer, their presence unmistakable despite their silence, and I watched as the reality of the situation slowly settled over Ethan's face. "This isn't fair," Ethan said, his voice cracking slightly, the anger giving way suddenly to something closer to desperation. "I loved you, Claire. Doesn't that count for anything?" "Love doesn't leave bruises," I said quietly, the words carrying years of unspoken pain finally finding their voice. "Love doesn't make someone afraid to come home. Whatever you felt for me, it stopped being love a long time ago, if it ever truly was." The bar had grown quieter around us, other patrons pretending not to notice the tension unfolding at the far end, though I could feel curious glances drifting our way. Ethan looked around briefly, seeming to register for the first time how exposed his desperation had become, how far he had fallen from whatever version of himself he still clung to in his own mind. "Fine," he said finally, his shoulders slumping, the fight draining visibly from his posture. "Fine, you win. I won't come near you again." "You made that promise once already," Damon said evenly. "Understand that this time, there will be no second warning. If you approach her again, in any form, through any means, the consequences will not be limited to conversation." Ethan's eyes flicked toward Damon's men standing nearby, then back toward me, something like genuine fear finally settling into his expression for the first time since we had arrived. He nodded slowly, gathered his jacket from the back of his chair, and left without another word, his footsteps unsteady as he pushed through the door and disappeared into the evening crowd outside. I exhaled slowly once he was gone, the tension that had gripped my chest for weeks, finally beginning to loosen its hold. Damon turned to face me, his expression softening from the controlled intensity of moments before into something warmer, more genuinely concerned. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. "I think so," I said, surprised by how true the words felt. "I think, for the first time in a long time, I actually am." We left the bar together, walking slowly toward the waiting car, the night air cool and clear around us. Damon's hand found mine somewhere along the short distance, and I did not pull away, allowing the simple warmth of the gesture to settle over me without the fear that usually accompanied closeness. "Thank you," I said as we reached the car, "for everything, for seeing what I tried so hard to hide, and choosing to act instead of looking away." "You never had to hide from me," Damon said, turning to face me fully, his expression open in a way I had rarely seen from him before. "Not then, and not now." I looked up at him, the city lights glowing softly around us, and felt something settle deep inside my chest, a quiet certainty that had been building steadily since the moment he first noticed the bruise on my wrist and refused to simply look away. Whatever fear had once defined my life, whatever silence I had once believed necessary for survival, it no longer held the same power over me. "I'm not the same person I was 3 weeks ago," I said softly. "No," Damon agreed, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his usual careful composure. "You're not. And I have to admit, I find this version of you rather remarkable." We stood together in the quiet evening, the weight of months of fear finally beginning to lift from my shoulders, replaced by something I had almost forgotten was possible, a future that did not require hiding, did not require shrinking myself into invisibility, did not require carrying pain silently behind carefully applied concealer and long sleeves. In the weeks that followed, my life slowly rebuilt itself into something unrecognizable from the careful, fearful existence I had maintained for so long. Ethan kept his distance, true to his word this time, whether from genuine understanding or simple fear of the consequences Damon had made unmistakably clear. I stopped flinching at unexpected sounds. I stopped checking locks 3 times before finally allowing myself to sleep. My relationship with Damon evolved slowly, carefully, built on the patience he had promised from the very beginning, rather than the urgency and control that had defined my life with Ethan. We took things slowly, allowing trust to rebuild itself naturally, without pressure, without the suffocating pace that had once made love feel indistinguishable from fear. Grace noticed the change in me almost immediately, commenting one afternoon that I finally looked like myself again, whatever that meant, to someone who had spent so long hiding behind careful masks. I laughed at the comment, though something in her words rang deeply true. I was becoming myself again, slowly, deliberately, no longer defined by the bruises I once hid, or the silence I once believed necessary for survival. Damon Cross had noticed what everyone else had missed, had refused to look away when it would have been so much easier to mind his own business, and in doing so, had given me something far more valuable than protection alone. He had given me permission to stop hiding, to trust again, to believe that safety and love could exist without fear, woven quietly through every quiet moment. Standing at my desk one final evening, watching the city lights flicker on beyond the office windows, I realized that the invisible woman who once arrived early and left late, who perfected the art of disappearing into the background of her own life, no longer existed. In her place stood someone who understood, finally and completely, that being seen was never something to fear, as long as the person doing the seeing chose to protect what they found rather than exploit it. A month after that night at the bar, Damon asked me to dinner, not as boss and secretary, not as protector and the woman he had shielded from danger, but simply as 2 people who had found something unexpected between them, amid the wreckage of a difficult season. We sat at a quiet restaurant far from the office, far from the careful boundaries we had maintained for so long, and talked for hours about things that had nothing to do with schedules or threats or the careful machinery of his business empire. He told me about his sister, how she had eventually rebuilt a life full of laughter and confidence, how she now ran a small design studio 2 cities away, thriving in ways that once seemed impossible during the darkest months of her own recovery. I told him about my own plans, tentative but growing steadier by the day, thoughts of eventually pursuing further education, of building a version of my life that extended beyond the careful, invisible role I had occupied for so long. "You don't have to stay in that position forever, you know," he said at one point, studying me across the candlelit table. "Whatever you want to build for yourself, I would support it fully, professionally or otherwise." "I know," I said, smiling in a way that felt entirely unguarded. For the first time, I actually believed that. Grace threw a small gathering a few weeks later, insisting I deserved to celebrate how far I had come, surrounded by people who genuinely cared, rather than the careful isolation I had maintained during my time with Ethan. Damon attended briefly, quiet and observant as always, though I caught him watching me throughout the evening with an expression of unmistakable warmth. The same careful attention he had once used to notice a bruise now turned toward noticing the small, genuine moments of my happiness instead. Ethan never returned. Whether fear kept him away, or some flicker of remaining conscience finally took hold, I did not know. And eventually, I stopped needing to know. His absence became simply another quiet fact of my life, no longer a looming threat shadowing every unexpected knock or unfamiliar car parked too long outside my building. Sometimes, late in the evening, I would catch myself standing at my apartment window, looking out over the city lights, and realize how far I had traveled from the woman who once sat frozen in her car, gathering courage to face another night of fear. That woman had learned to hide so completely that she nearly forgot what it felt like to simply exist without flinching, without calculating escape routes, without carrying secrets heavy enough to bend her spine. I was not that woman anymore. I stood taller now, spoke louder when it mattered, and no longer flinched at raised voices or unexpected footsteps in empty hallways. Damon had seen through my careful disguise when no one else had bothered to look closely enough, and in choosing to act rather than simply notice, he had given me back something I thought Ethan had taken permanently, the simple, radical freedom of no longer needing to hide. I was no longer hiding, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I never wanted to hide again.